Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to our third Reimagining Student Mobility webinar that Formative has put on. I think this is going to be a series that will continue. We've had a really great positive response from folks that have attended the prior webinars and that have now visited our Student Mobility Hub. And so we hope to keep these conversations going. We really appreciate your participation and feedback and reactions that we've received. So today's conversation, we started a couple weeks ago or now a couple months ago, a month and a half ago, talking about how we think about the problems of student mobility. We launched into a specific solutions framework last time, which was around differentiated strategic differentiation of services. And then today we're going to talk about policy ideas. We're working on a funding specific white paper and set of topics and recommendations that will be on our hub as well. But right now, the focus of today's conversation is going to be around policies that we see as, in particular, state-level policies, and I'll explain kind of some of the different layers and how this policy landscape works in student transportation. But in particular today, talking about state-level levers that we think are enabling of the kinds of solutions that we see as necessary to get to this future of student mobility. So we're going to talk about this today, the playbook that we've developed, and these policy recommendations, these ideas that we're talking about are also up on our Student Mobility Hub that I will revisit and share the link to again during the course of today's conversation. So just to reintroduce myself, as I will at the beginning of all of these sessions, I am the CEO and founder of Formative. I kind of came into this business as an outsider, as an engineer and an urban planner, but then found myself in a role, as many of us in this profession do, not expecting it, but finding myself in the role of Director of Transportation for Boston Public Schools. And that's really where I cut my chops in student transportation, but have also worked in the private sector in transportation and then with a network of charter schools. And together with my co-founders of Formative, we saw an opportunity and these sets of challenges that have only gotten more acute, but an opportunity within student transportation to innovate, and that there was kind of an old way of doing things, an old model that was one size fits all, that wasn't adapting to the new imperatives and how our education systems have developed and changed. And so that's what we've set out to do in terms of our management work and our consultative work. And with these webinars and these conversations we're trying to start. So our mission as a manager and a consultant and thought leader in student transportation is to think about multimodal student mobility, use of technology, and use of these new kinds of solutions to expand options, enhance service for families, and ultimately enhance safety and sustainability for schools and school systems. And we think about sustainability really broadly as it pertains to both environmental sustainability, financial and operational sustainability for school systems. And ultimately, the goal is that our systems can provide equitable access to learning opportunities that maximize every student's potential. And there's recognition, the need here is that our systems can adapt to make sure that access is there. Formative as a business, we are managing in a tech-enabled way with a platform that we've created, systems in more than 40 schools across the country in a number of different cities. And then we also do consultative work with big districts and state systems and others. This project, these webinars, the Student Mobility Resource Hub that we've created is with the support of the Walton Family Foundation and Bellwether Education Partners. But again, all part of our work in service of the mission that I just shared. And this resource hub is something that we've created, studentmobilityhub.formative.org, where these webinars are going to reside, where our playbooks are going to reside. We've also published now a host of white papers, case studies, and other resources, including external resources we will continue to publish here, and hope that this can become a place that is useful to practitioners and policymakers, and those in particular, I think our audience is those in the education space that maybe, want to understand more of the nuance and complexity of student transportation. And so today, I'll just again mention that one of the key audiences for this policy playbook is, again, it's about enhancing folks' understanding, also in particular for folks that are advocates, that are funders, that are people working in the policy sphere within education, them understanding where the levers are within transportation to move the needle on the broader priorities within education. And so these things can be, brought in, pursued independently as it relates to, understanding where transportation can enable other goals that we have for education, but also, maybe where there's synergies or where there's alignment between things that would help if pursued in transportation and other initiatives that are being undertaken in the education sphere more broadly. So just to get the conversation started today, before we dig in on the policy playbook, we've got a little activator poll. I will let Mary jump in and explain. And this is just to get your juices flowing and thinking about one key dimension of student mobility that relates to our policy ideas.
Hi, everyone. So we're about to pop up here an activator poll, and we're just curious to hear from the folks that are gathered your best guess on what proportion of students ride a school bus every day to school as their primary mode of transportation. So your options are 90%, 75%, 50%, or a third. So Jesse's going to throw it up here. We're curious to see what everyone thinks. Can you give folks a couple more seconds to put in their vote? All right, let's see what folks said. Let's pop it up there. So it looks like the most common guess was 75%, followed by 50%. So thinking half of students ride a bus to school every day, and then the least, and then a third. No one chose 90%. So everyone knows that it's not that ubiquitous. Great. I'm excited to see folks' guesses. So, I mean, the correct answer is just around 50%. So recently, folks might have seen in the news that the National Household Travel Survey results from 2022 were recently released, and the findings show that just over half, so 53% of students travel via a private car. So typically that's parent transport, and 11% walk or ride their bike. And so a third of students, so that amongst those selected, the least commonly selected, a third of students are riding the bus every day to school. And this has been a proportion that's been shrinking steadily over the years, for which we have data. And as you can see here in the chart that we've got up for y'all here, you can see that it's been declining at the same time that private vehicle transport has been increasing. And there are a lot of, assumptions that researchers have about why that is. Part of it is certainly around, where schools are located and where families are moving to, and just sparsity. And also just around general preferences and folks finding that school bus transport is just not meeting their needs. And families that are more well-resourced, that have a reliable private vehicle and a schedule that permits them to be able to take on that burden of transporting their child are relying on private vehicle travel. Whereas if we look at families that are more, below the poverty line, or that are less well-resourced, they're actually disproportionately relying on school bus transport. So we're seeing some inequities there around modes and who school bus or private transport is serving. And so today we're going to dive into this a little bit in terms of, what are, from a policy standpoint, what might be some of the pieces at play that might be able to both meet student and family needs and ensure whatever modes are being provided, that they're being provided equitably. So with that context, I'm going to pass it back to you, Carl.
Thanks, Mary. So just to add as well, I think, again, we'll probably have another conversation. We'll definitely have another paper, a playbook that will be published to our resource hub that's differentiating funding specific solutions versus policy solutions. So when we're talking about policy solutions today, we're speaking more about regulatory sorts of solutions. And so, I think, but for those of you that have been to our prior webinars, or kind of know the way we think about things, one of our aims is to, and I mentioned in our mission, creating these more sustainable ecosystems. And so how can we better leverage public transit, encourage more active transport, encourage more ride sharing and efficient use of school buses? Clearly, we're talking about expanding the mix of services. So in some instances, there's, places where we would want to see more use of school buses, but in a lot of instances, we're looking at, these other alternative modalities to the school bus where a school bus can't be leveraged efficiently. But I think that red line there that you see on the graph, students being driven privately by their families is the big thing that we've identified as a challenge for a couple of different reasons. One, from an environmental sustainability standpoint, it's just it's the worst outcome in terms of the amount of emissions per unit transport, right? Then there's practical considerations for schools, like their physical plant and traffic, and just the kind of chaos and accountability and safety of having every kid arriving in a private vehicle. But then, as Mary mentioned, it's really about also this equity component, which says, which is that part of what you're seeing here is an increase in the complexity of student demand, and students want, and also the complexity of parent schedules. And so ultimately, where systems aren't able to meet the needs of families, I believe, are increasingly moving to try to meet their own needs. And so then you're creating a widening gap of students without private means, that are stuck on inadequate systems, and leaving those that have private means with the ability to access other varied opportunities. And so, our answer is not that, well, everybody should have a car and take their own kids. Our answer is that our school systems need to be better equipped to adapt and meet the needs of families. And there's also other ways to attack the private vehicle problem, which is that where those can aggregate, we should be doing that as well. So we're really taking an all hands on deck approach. But so this is really key, validating point to understand our take of one of the key challenges in student mobility. So just as we talk about the policy landscape, I'm going to revisit our high-level problem framework, which is that we see transportation as a key barrier to equitable access, that it's always been hard, right? And we're going to talk about policy and funding, specifically policy today that restricts what you can do, that it makes it complicated and creates weird incentives, and is also very patchwork across the country. There's system fragmentation, which has really to do with, our hyper-localized education system, and that every district and now charter LEAs and micro schools and, other programs that support schools and offer out-of-school time programming, they are not connected in their efforts to provide transportation. They are fragmented. They are all going it alone and doing things in a silo. That's a huge challenge. And then the capacity gaps, one of the key ones being that transportation, logistics, and operating hyper sophisticated multimodal transit systems are not the core capacity of our schools. And schools weren't designed for that. And so again, by no fault of their own, they don't have the resources, the ability, to pull off this Herculean task that is becoming harder and harder. And so that's a key challenge within our school systems. But then these exogenous forces that continue to become more acute on the demand side, as I mentioned, I think is evident by this increase in private transport. Students' needs are becoming more complex and individualized. They're wanting more choice. They're wanting more individualization and customization of their education. And their expectations for what service should look like has increased and continues to increase. And so the demand is harder to meet. At the same time, supply has become constrained. Drivers are short. There's competition in labor markets. Driving a school bus under the conditions that have historically been acceptable is not as good of an offering as it used to be. And the cost of transportation, the cost of inputs, the cost of fuel, supply chains under strain, all these things have contributed to making things even harder. So speaking then specifically to the policy side and digging into that problem frame, here's a graphic that that shows you sort of the patchwork. You don't see the key, but what this represents is in our research, identifying where there are different sets of requirements, different allowances for vehicles, different funding formula, and different sets of conditions across all the states. So that's just one thing to keep in mind without any much specificity to that graph, but it's a patchwork literally across the country. The federal government defines key things. And so there are things that we could advocate for and think about at the federal level that would help across all states. And so we make a nod to that, but our focus today is going to be more on state level policy. But federal government basically, they define the CDL, they define some of the key endorsements. They set the baseline requirements for school bus, defining what a school bus is, even the color. National School Bus glossy yellow. So there's a longstanding tradition of federal government setting some of these baseline terms. But then there is a lot of variety across states, a tremendous amount of variety in terms of which types of transport a school bus is, as defined by the feds, is required to be used, or where non-school buses can be used. And that relates to activity buses or multifunction student activity buses, MFSABs, 15 passenger vans, full-size vans, or smaller passenger vehicles, and 10 passengers, 10 to 15 passenger vehicles, often treated very differently from regular passenger minivans, SUVs, and sedans. And then how they, just as states can say, set the boundaries around which school buses can be used, states can also set different thresholds where a CDL is necessary, or they can add additional certificates or additional kinds of certifications that are required for drivers. In some states, non-school bus vehicles still require a CDL, or in some instances, certain ones do, the larger vans, for example, and certain ones don't. Adding to the confusion is the fact that often these regulations exist in multiple places. So there may be some within education, in the Department of Education and enforced therein. There may be some as part of Departments of Transportation and DOT regulations. There may be some enforcement and regulations that are the purview of the state patrol or of a separate school bus safety committee that is set up by a governor, or within the confines of a Department of Motor Vehicles, of Registry of Motor Vehicles. So that can add an additional layers of complexity, where even just within a single state, it's hard to figure out what exactly the requirements are. And finally, states and even school districts then may impose additional requirements on drivers as far as training, or different kinds of background checks, different kinds of, I mentioned certifications or other exams, but that's really a tapestry as well, state by state, and can be even hyper-local, specific districts and so on. And so the challenge is for, if we're trying to make progress at a state level, at a national level, moving the needle on this problem, we have to navigate all these policies where there are, entities, businesses trying to create new models, offer new solutions, and scale to do so in different states. They may be really hampered and restricted from working in certain states, obviously, but even just the costs or the friction, if you will, of entering or creating, entering markets, trying to scale their solutions can be very challenging. Then within states, districts trying to recruit individuals, trying to navigate what are the requirements for me to become a driver, what can I drive, or if you are a small business owner trying to create a small fleet, or buy a couple buses or use your van and service the school system. It's very hard for individuals to navigate these systems and figure out what needs to be done and make sure that they're being compliant with local regulations. And so this is a huge challenge. And so in order that we think systematically nationally about reimagining student mobilities, we have to address this. These administrative hurdles, these weird incentives, all this tapestry of policies that really makes it, either impossible to operate or just really, really confusing and challenging, and puts up, barriers that are getting in the way of us solving this really critical problem. So this was our high-level solutions framework, and that we have shared before. But on the policy and funding side, again, the things that we're going to talk about today, I mentioned focusing on the state level. A lot of it now relates to flexibility. So how can we create more flexibilities for local, contextual, more appropriate and right-sized solutions to take root and to be effective, and also to scale within states and across states? How can, allowing for then the kinds of solutions we talked about last time that are really differentiated and smartly matched to the specific needs that students have, the specific needs of certain communities, certain vendor environments and physical, geographies and characteristics of places and programs, that, so that the solutions that are right for those contexts can be deployed. And then also, we talk about solutions that cut across into other areas like infrastructure, public transportation more generally, housing. These kinds of solutions are inextricably linked to what happens in education, what happens in student transportation. We get into that a little bit more when we talk about the funding side. But also, a lot of these things, when implemented correctly, when approached in a thoughtful way, and when we're able to right-size solutions, a lot of them are really, really aligned with sustainability goals, environmental goals, and so want to make sure that those connections are being made too. And I mentioned also just connections with what we're doing in transportation-specific policy, with what we're doing in education policy, and how education systems are being funded more generally. So I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions before we dig into the playbook, as far as the, just our view of the problem and kind of the current policy and regulatory landscape, or just the focus of today. We'll just pause there for a moment. All right. So I had an opportunity to get a drink of water. Why don't I jump right in? So what we're sharing here today, again, these are a set of 7 policy ideas. They're still high level. They're not hyper granular, hyper specific. And part of this is recognition that we are putting this out for a national audience. We're trying to be generalizable in many respects to different states and different contexts, but also trying to be as specific as possible to help you, who may be a practitioner or maybe an advocate or maybe working in your specific context, that you could take this, know where to look, for the relevant regulations, the relevant policies in your state, in your area, to see if some of these recommendations, make sense for you. And again, recognizing that even just figuring out the landscape within a specific state can be really challenging, and things are actively in motion right now. So a lot of this stuff is is being addressed in different ways, and we'll and a lot of new interesting lessons being learned and things being tested, that I'll try to mention some of the ones that we're aware of as I go in. So the first one is about expanding vehicle allowances. I think this one is probably the most straightforward, but you have many states, for example, where a yellow bus is defined as almost the only thing that's allowed to transport students, with very narrow, if any, exceptions. And so that applies whether, it's an in city district where you've got a lot of density and you can fit 50 or 60 students on a vehicle, all the way down to situations where you're meeting compliance requirements of a McKinney-Vento student, that maybe is displaced or sheltered 40 miles away from a school. And so you may have one student riding on a bus. In this example, in some states, I think Georgia is an example of where it's most restrictive. School buses are almost in every case the only thing that's allowed to be used. So here's an example of where, again, not getting into the specifics of different kinds of vehicles, but where there's just such hyper restriction that we think this is really important lens and a first lens for folks to look at, that it's really hard to argue from any perspective, from cost efficiency perspective or an environmental perspective, for example, that sending a bus for one student or two students or three students makes sense. And it also, in our communities, can often contribute to the perception that we as transportation professionals don't know what we're doing. I had lots of conversations with folks when I was in Boston about, seeing all the empty buses, and I had to explain, about coming from the yard, and you can only pick up one student at a time. And there's lots of times when, in the normal course of business, a vehicle will be empty, but people do have a sense of, that it is impractical and silly, seemingly, to send a school bus for 3 students. And neither is it, again, environmentally sensible to have this big diesel giant vehicle when you could have an EV or a hybrid vehicle, or even any ordinary sedan that would emit less if you're only transporting 3 students. So of course, again, as with anything else, everything in right measure, right? So if everyone was in small vehicles, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about a flexibility to use means that are other than a yellow school bus where it is appropriate. So where you have low density students, students with special needs, McKinney-Vento students, having that flexibility, or one-off kinds of trips, having to send a student home in the middle of the day, that we need to be allowed to use options like sedans, SUVs, minivans, or even 10-passenger vans. I would even say, NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, has come out with new guidance specific to 15-passenger vans or full-size vans, which are restricted across almost all states. There's very few states that allow these. And one of the historic concerns about these vehicles has been rollover safety. But even NHTSA, and even where states don't explicitly prohibit it, they typically rely on that guidance from NHTSA that talks about the rollover concern. But now NHTSA's more recent guidance talks about new models, and specifically electric 15-passenger vans and larger vans, 10-passenger vans and up, as really significantly addressing and completely alleviating the rollover concern because of electronic stability control, and then particular to electronic vehicles, or EVs, models that are more of which are coming out, that because of the lower center of gravity, this rollover concern is addressed, is significantly addressed. And so we think there's real opportunity here to maintain safety, but expand the kinds of vehicles that are allowed to provide student transportation. Safety, this is when we talk about capacity gaps too, we talk about changing mindsets. And there is a mindset that a school bus is the only safe option for a kid. And I've mentioned this before, but it's hard to argue that in a crash, anything else is going to be as safe as a school bus. But what this is doing, and what we're trying to do in the conversation here, is having an honest assessment of the various trade-offs involved, including costs, including sustainability, and then a recognition that you can create safety with respect to driver training, with respect to tracking and communications, and even new collision avoidance systems or driver assistance technologies in vehicles that talked about, lower center of gravity and electronic stability control, that other kinds of vehicles can be very safe and good and right options for kids if we don't have such a narrow view and allow some flexibility. So that's number one. Number two, there are very practical considerations that states can undertake with respect to CDL. Some of you might be aware in the last couple of years, they had tried a program at the federal level where candidates could be exempt from the under the hood components of the CDL exam, which was basically mechanical knowledge about a school bus and things that in my practical experience and talking to districts and operations across the country, that that drivers don't need to know, how to maintain a school bus, how to, understanding more of the mechanical workings of the school bus. But these are parts of the CDL exam that really make it challenging for someone who wants to come and serve kids and wants to operate the vehicle, and we need them to operate it safely. But things that they really don't actually need to know. And it includes other things about transporting hazardous materials and a whole host of things that are relevant to the broad category of commercial driving, but not necessarily for transporting students. So while that's a bigger conversation, there are things within states where, again, I had mentioned that states can determine where the CDL should apply, and may there be different classes of CDLs that are a little bit easier to acquire. And so in this environment of, driver shortage and trying to find folks that are willing to want to serve students, want to be connected with school systems, are driven by mission, and can be trained to drive a vehicle with a little bit of help, but maybe don't need to, it's not as important that they have a grasp of all the things and do all the things that we require as part of the CDL exam, that you can require lower classes of CDLs. And then in those states where we say that van drivers require CDLs, that those restrictions can be reevaluated and lifted. That can be, again, where vans might be allowed to have a driver of a van, who may be transporting, again, students with special needs or McKinney-Vento students, and some of our most vulnerable students with the most urgent needs, to put that barrier up that they need to have a CDL, which is supremely inapplicable in so many ways to operating a van or a sedan or a smaller vehicle, that we believe that's just putting up a needless barrier. And so states, New Jersey is one, and there are others. We see that as kind of as something that we should take up within our states. So number three is a very meaty one, and this one might be a little bit fuzzier because it's a really hard one where we want to ensure safety. Safety has to be a non-negotiable of all these, and we think that safety of the driver is really the common denominator across all these modes. And so we think there's an opportunity to more clearly define, and this could be a federal initiative, but also just kind of aligning across where other states have adopted new, clearer standards, but deciding what makes a driver safe to transport students and extending that definition across modes, that would go a long way to just help clarify for drivers and for operators and for districts and small businesses and national operators, so that we agree on what that standard is, and that we define those things that matter when it comes to driving behavior. And that is, readiness to drive, how we're assessing and measuring performance. And, now we have the ability to really monitor and evaluate the risky behaviors that are actually the things that actuarially, or from an insurance standpoint, we know are the risky behaviors that cause accidents, like speeding, driving too fast for conditions, specifically following too close, and distraction, right? Those are some of the real top behaviors that ultimately are the root causes of accidents. And so we have new means now of measuring these things that we need to start using and also research around, what are the real training elements that make drivers better able to de-escalate, better able to manage behavior, and working with special needs. We have a strong interest in making sure that our drivers, if our focus has been too much on CDL, we think, and some of these mechanics that are critical to safe operation of vehicles in general, but perhaps too much of a focus on that, too many barriers there where we're excluding folks that might be better in the soft skill side of things, that might be better working with our children, de-escalating behavior, where we could train them to operate a vehicle safely and then focus on measuring them on and evaluating them on those risky behaviors that we know really affect accidents. So this is one where, less clear policy prescription here and more guidance around, let's have a smart conversation about what really makes our kids safe. How can we flip the script a little bit and attract more drivers and help them through, not put up artificial barriers for them, that we can have folks that are safe in a holistic sense in working with our kids, that then if with clear standards, then we can open up the profession to more folks and actually enhance safety. So allowing for diverse and differentiated modes. So now this is thinking about beyond the specific kinds of vehicles. This is really thinking about a little bit more outside the box, including things like, beyond use of small vehicles per se, use of other kinds of models of driving, like rideshare, or use of independent contractors or owner drivers. So programs like Hop, Skip, Drive, like Adroit, like Everdriven, and others, assist services. I'm going to name all the ones that I know. I know there are others where, you have folks that in this new gig economy might be doing other things, but as long as they can meet these more standard driver safety requirements, and we have some modicum of oversight and assurance that their vehicles are safe, that they can be leveraged where appropriate, where they can be used efficiently and also safely, but also extending to things like public transit. There aren't a lot of states that prohibit use of public transit, but this then gets into more of the funding conversation where you can support it, where you can engender it and remove barriers to use of public transit. And then finally, direct to parent stipends, again, not trying to encourage more private driving, private vehicle use, but it's part of this is just a recognition, meeting folks where they are, where systems can't adjust immediately to provide service for a student in certain circumstances. Sometimes the most cost-effective means of getting a student into school is to support a parent with a stipend, and can actually be the environmental choice. If the parent's driving to work and providing them some additional stipend to, add some incremental amount of mileage onto their commute to transport their students to school, or help them compensate for some loss of, work time by doing that, that might be lower VMT, lower emissions, and lower cost overall than sending a private hired vehicle, certainly a bus, to pick up that student. And so thinking about ways that these kinds of additional modalities and supports can be allowed with oversight, and we'll talk about, data and other ways that states and authorities can be assured that their funding and these new kinds of programs are being implemented in a smart way. First, we just need to allow these things to happen. And then I think great examples like the A for Arizona grant program, where you have these kind of laboratories that are allowing these new kinds of solutions to be experimented with in an environment of accountability and transparency, are the ways that we're going to then learn how to really thoughtfully implement these kinds of programs. But first, we've just got to have the ability to try some of this stuff. All right, number 5 has to do with the kinds of things that a DMV, an RMV, a Department of Motor Vehicles, or State Patrol in different states can erect different kinds of barriers and have all kinds of arcane requirements for, even if a van or a sedan or a full-size van or an MFSAB are allowed to do certain things, that there's a whole, again, a patchwork is consistent with the rest of this presentation of different requirements like signage, flashers, markings, um, backup alarms, other specialized equipment that is required to be in vehicles like fire extinguishers and seatbelt cutters and obstructed airway kits and bio cleanup kits and things like this that they can, many of which, and we, for example, we had some great conversations with the state of Rhode Island and their DMV where they had requirements in there that they knew were not enforced, but yet, and they couldn't even articulate what the requirement was. This was we were talking about an obstructed airway kit. They didn't even know what it was, but yet the requirement was there, and it was cited by, vendors who wanted to enter the market, small businesses and national vendors alike, that were confused and saw these barriers as costly and prohibitive to them entering the marketplace. And so we believe that states should really take a really close look at all these extra requirements, and be really thoughtful about which ones they think are really necessary for public safety, for student safety, and which ones, not to be cynical, but were just set up as a way of putting up barriers to prevent more competition, more options, in terms of the supply and vendor environment, are really an adult problem when some of these vehicles could provide solutions for kids. So that's one of our key themes here, is that we see a lot of barriers that are erected by adults under false pretenses here, that under the guise of safety, some of these things have been put in there when folks knew full well that they weren't actually enhancing safety. They're just designed to keep others out and away from business that was theirs. And so this is where we want to challenge folks to look critically. Managing risk, number 6, and I know I'm getting close to time, so I want to get through these, but managing risk, help manage risk. We believe that there's a role that states in particular, but also the federal government and also private actors, insurance companies too, regulators can play in terms of supporting new solutions, helping to mitigate risk for operators, for school systems, for insurers to be willing to try some of these new solutions. So we've seen cases where policy has changed, there's funding, and there's willingness to try new things. And then the barrier or the thing that pops up to stop something from happening is an inability to get insurance to be able to do a new thing. And one example is where we've had schools that have assets, buses, and they're wanting to use those buses to serve other schools as a way to support, other schools in their community, as a way to generate offsetting revenue and help them control costs. And as a way for them as a community, a school community, to create new supply options to, give access to kids where there was a dearth of vendor options in a particular market. And then with all these pieces in place, when they've tried to launch such services, it's the insurance provider saying, this is new, this is too risky, you're not able to do this, without them having the opportunity to prove it out and show that they can be a safe operator as well. And in many cases, this was even schools that had been operating service for themselves for years and years and years, and were very experienced, but yet weren't, it was seen as too risky for them to provide service for another school in their community. So finally, and this I think complements the other initiatives, how can we make sure that, insofar as you're loosening regulations, you're allowing for more kinds of options to be deployed, that they can be done so safely, that they're being used smartly and efficiently, that we're not opening Pandora's box and creating more problems with respect to the climate, or schools getting themselves into unsustainable financial situations, or making students unsafe. And so we've seen some thoughtful approaches here. There was some new legislation in Virginia around expanding use of different kinds of vehicles, around using direct-to-parent stipends, where new allowances were accompanied by new reporting requirements that were more thoughtful, and transparency around the efficiency of how, different modes were being deployed, the utilization, routed and planned utilization, actual ridership, more thoughtful and comprehensive requirements that we felt like were a fair trade for allowing certain new kinds of operators and systems and new solutions to be tested and tried, that this data wasn't onerous to produce. But also, so it allows for monitoring, creates transparency so that we can study and learn from these solutions and how they're being deployed and what the actual results are in terms of reducing mileage, reducing cost per student, improving the environment, making sure safety is maintained. And so, but then also recognizing that, what states have currently often, where they have anything at all, are very kind of blunt instruments that don't recognize the differences of, one, let's say a charter school that's offering a very unique sort of curriculum and is trying to serve a broader geography, that their cost per student, let's say, is going to look very different than the cost per student of a very tight assignment zone district that only runs buses, or another school that has a large population of students that require door-to-door transportation, or has a large percentage of students experiencing homelessness, or a rural school that just has a massive geography to cover, and therefore, cost per student measures, for example, mileage and odometer readings as sort of proxies for efficiency are inadequate. And so we need to start thinking about cost per student mile, about sparsity factors, about, creating definitions that are appropriate for the kinds of work that different school systems are trying to do and the contexts in which they're doing that work. So lastly, I'll just say that this data is going to be very interesting, as it relates to deploying of new modes. It's also really critical as it relates to supporting and better understanding the transformation of our fleets and as we electrify. And so there, again, not as many specific policy prescriptions here, but we think this is kind of this conversation needs to be had as along with all the other conversations as we're changing the nature of the service, we're changing the nature of the modes being used, we're changing the technologies being used. We want to maintain safety, we want to maintain efficiency. We have these theories. The way to test them, the way to see that they're bearing out is by having smart and not too onerous data standards and reporting standards that's going to give then those of us too that are interested in studying this troves of ways of learning, and then we can share back with the community. So this is our last recommendation. I'll pause there and hope that there's a few questions. I see, okay, question about specific policy priorities for electrification, which is an area with a lot of evolution and attention right now. What policy recommendations would you have for fleet electrification? So I think probably the biggest point on this, so I think the funding conversation is a different one, and I think there's lots of exciting things happening on the funding side of things that I support around subsidizing upfront capital and the infrastructure, public subsidies for infrastructure that enables electrification. I think that's more of a funding than a policy conversation per se. On the policy side, I think one thing might have to, the most relevant one I think is this last point about data and just transparency as we're implementing around mileage and costs and other features of these electric systems that are going to help us understand better the contexts where they're going to be more able to scale and where the solutions are working or where maybe more work needs to be done in terms of, again, charging infrastructure, whether it's weather-related factors or mileage-related factors. But I think maybe, you know, mandates around that could accompany some of the funding carrots, so that we can have more standardized, you know, and transparent data that those in the industry, that policymakers can learn from. I think that's for the most important thing. I see many ride-sharing companies trying to lower driver standards to meet their IC model instead of just changing the vehicle requirements to be applicable to the non-CDL vehicle. So I think the driver is the most important, is one of the singularly most important factor in terms of holistic safety. And so I don't support lowering driver standards in any way, shape, or form. I do think sometimes, I think the ride-sharing companies often make a good point that is in some ways self-serving about things like drug testing, right? Where drug testing, again, if you're cynical and you just understand the reality of, if you're a transportation director in Colorado, you know, them kind of taking the standpoint of, you know, finding people that can pass a drug test in this new, you know, permissive drug environment is really challenging. We just have to find people that can pass a drug test. And, you know, the cynical view is, well, they'll just say, you know, if someone fails a drug test, just come back when you can pass one. And is that just creating an administrative kind of hurdle and friction to getting somebody hired? And does it, you know, does it actually, it doesn't actually measure impairment on the road, right? Like say, maybe randoms do a little bit better job of that, or post-accident investigations, but that if we, you know, now we do have the ability to more smartly measure actual driver behavior or distraction or impairment or fatigue. So technology offers a lot of promise. And so I think there's a good point that says, look, if you can, without lowering standards, in some ways you could actually raise standards if companies are saying, well, okay, in lieu of XYZ, you need to then demonstrate and share data and share that demonstrate and prove that you're monitoring driver behavior and able to intervene when there's instances of distraction or detect impairment, things like this. So I think if the focus was more on risky behavior, impairment, training, and less just on kind of traditional blunt instrument administrative hurdles, I think we could get to a more rigorous uniform standard that's also practically accessible for folks, that then would ultimately be better. But I do think, right, like I don't, you know, I think there's always a tendency for folks in competition and private businesses that are trying to serve this space to want to erect barriers for others and reduce barriers for themselves. I think so. We're trying to have an honest, transparent conversation that cuts through some of that, right, and recognizes where there's good points being made about, you know, we don't want to sacrifice safety. We have to find ways to, we want to make that, we want to assure safety, but also make it clear and consistent across markets, and have, and with transparency, with better data, with new technologies, there's ways to expand allowances and maintain or even enhance safety. Okay, I think I can take one more. Let me see. Has the Mass DOT or RMV been approached about these policies? That's Massachusetts. I have not specifically approached Massachusetts or looked into the latest with respect to Massachusetts, but I don't know how similar they are to Rhode Island, but Formative has done work with state of Rhode Island and had lots of interesting conversations, I think. And I think there was some momentum, although not yet meaningful change with respect to use of larger vans, for example. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity, especially, again, just having an honest conversation about the rollover concern for bigger vans has been one of the you know, the main talking point against using these bigger vans. But yet, you know, the specific NHTSA guidance now with respect to electronic stability control in electric vehicles, I think provides an opportunity maybe to align, you know, expanding options with electrification and climate goals in this class of vehicle. And then we worked with the Rhode Island state system, for example, and this is common across districts, but even if you do a whole efficiency workup across these systems where there's lots of low density trips, and students, these are regional trips, for example, with that the state system was running. Anywhere you had a vehicle that was, planned or could only pick up, again, even if perfectly efficiently routed, could pick up 14 or fewer students. Just swapping out an electric van with a full-size bus saved cost, saved emissions, and reduce the need for a CDL driver. I mean, that's one of the biggest imperatives, is just this dearth of supply of CDL drivers, that these vans, when deployed safely and efficiently, can really cut into that challenge. And of course, again, we do a lot of other work on how do you better design systems and be as efficient as you can with those assets. But then even after you've done that, there's a tremendous opportunity for these bigger vans to be leveraged, and even small, minivans and sedans in some instances, but more select instances. All right. We are out of time. Really enjoyed the questions, appreciate that. And I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. Hope you come to our hub. I hope you reach out. Please feel free to reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation with you, or if you've got other ideas or resources, things that you think we could cover, external resources to include in our site. And we hope to keep you on our list, and we'll keep you posted. Our goal is to maybe do one of these webinars quarterly, and we will keep you informed as we do. Thanks very much, and I hope everyone has a great day.